Joshua stands in the gray, shifting ash of Jericho, watching the final wooden beams of the Canaanite fortress burn down to nothing. He does not raise his sword in victory. He does not order his men to plant a flag or set up a monument of triumph. Instead, he steps to the edge of the ruin, opens his mouth, and speaks a hyper-specific, chronological blood equation into the smoking soil. Picture it. The dust is still settling. The screaming has just stopped, and the leader of Israel is already locking the future of this geography behind a terrible door. In the King James Bible, the decree is recorded in Joshua chapter 6, verse 26. And Joshua adjured them at that time, saying, "Cursed be the man before the Lord, that riseth up and buildeth this city Jericho. He shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn, and in his youngest son shall he set up the gates of it." Stop right there. Read that again. He is not simply warning his people to stay away from the rubble. He is setting a spiritual tripwire. Why does the rebuilding of a ruined wall demand the exact, sequential death of a man's sons? Look closely at the construction sequence. The foundation, the gates, first to last, the alpha and omega of ancient masonry, and matched to that timeline is a biological one. The firstborn, the youngest, the beginning of a man's strength, and the absolute end of his lineage. See the scene. Joshua is not speaking a metaphor. He is laying down a law of dark spiritual architecture. The soil of Jericho was prime real estate. It was an oasis, the city of palm trees, watered by deep and ancient springs. Tactically, it should have been the first permanent settlement of the new nation, but Joshua leaves it a wasteland. He turns an oasis into a permanent, open grave. Sit with that. To understand the weight of what is happening in the ash, we have to look outside the Western reading. There is an ancient Aramaic paraphrase of the Hebrew prophets, called Targum Jonathan, read aloud in the synagogues of antiquity. And Targum Jonathan refuses to let this curse remain a vague, poetic threat. It records the ancient Jewish understanding that Joshua was not just speaking angry words into the air. He was binding the very gates of the city with a curse that demanded a specific payment in flesh. The text of the Targum expands the horror, emphasizing that the builder would literally seal the fate of his children into the stonework. The canonical text does not say God will strike the children down from the sky. The text says the builder will lay the foundation in his firstborn. The preposition is everything. It is not a distant judgment. It is a dark transaction triggered in the dirt. Joshua is sealing the physical dirt itself, locking it away from the human race. But the mystery remains. How does speaking words over dead stones guarantee that a child will drop dead centuries later? Joshua has spoken a chronological death sentence over the ruins, transforming prime land into an untouched monument of fear. But the ashes of Jericho conceal a much older reason for why the price of the walls had to be the lives of children. What terrifying architectural ritual was Joshua forcing his people to leave buried in the dust? Look down at the ashes covering the streets of Jericho. Before the chronological blood equation was ever spoken over the ruined gates, God had already categorized the city and everything inside it. In the King James Version, Joshua 6:17 lays down the ruling, "And the city shall be accursed, even it, and all that are therein, to the Lord." Stop right there. The word the translators rendered as accursed hides a terrifying reality in the original text. Turn the English back into the Hebrew, and the word is sherem. It does not simply mean bad, and it does not mean condemned in a general, moral sense. Cherem is a technical, devastating classification. It means a thing devoted entirely to destruction, set apart for God alone, rendering it permanently untouchable by human hands. Picture it. The gold, the silver, the timber, the foundation stones. Everything inside the city limits is spiritually irradiated. To touch the ash, to move a stone, to pocket a single silver shekel from the rubble is to cross a boundary line drawn in divine fire. Same soil, same consequence. We assume a conquered city is meant to be plundered, its resources repurposed to build up the victors. But a city under the Sherem ban flips the entire nature of ancient warfare. The ground is quarantined. Jericho was the tactical throat of the Jordan Valley, a lush oasis fed by deep springs, yet Israel is commanded to leave it as a haunting wasteland. By declaring the entire city Sherem, God demands the absolute firstfruits of the conquest, and the method of delivery is complete desolation. Watch what the text does in the very next chapter. A soldier of Israel named Achan takes a beautiful Babylonian garment and some silver from the rubble, hiding the spoils under the floor of his tent. He violates the cherem. The result is immediate, lethal military disaster for the entire nation at the Battle of Ai. The contagion of the accursed thing spreads upon contact. The foundation stones of Jericho were not just heavy rocks, they were radioactive. We see this profound dread reflected centuries later in the writings of Flavius Josephus. In his Antiquities of the Jews, the first-century historian notes the absolute terror the ancient world held for foundation oaths. Josephus records that Joshua dedicated the city to be an everlasting desolation, a monument not of Israel's military strength, but of God's absolute, terrifying claim over the threshold of the promised land. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact, but it aligns perfectly with the physical reality of the valley. See the scene. A massive army walking away from perfectly good-dressed masonry, and a water source that could sustain a new capital. They leave it completely to the wind and the scavengers. Because touching the foundation of Jericho is not a building code violation, it is the theft of a holy devotion, punishable by the erasure of the thief. So the dirt sits untouched. The ruins sink deeper into the mud, year after year, decade after decade. But the spiritual weight of Joshua's decree did not dissipate with the shifting desert winds. It concentrated. The foundation stones waited in the dark, holding the blood equation like a loaded spring. The ashes of Jericho were left undisturbed by the tribes of Israel. But the silence of the valley only masked a dormant trigger waiting for a hand to test it. A sect of desert scribes living by the Dead Sea would later record exactly what they believed was sleeping beneath that dirt. What did the scroll keepers of the Qumran caves know about the curse that the rest of the world had forgotten? Walk 20 miles south of the smoking ruins of Jericho. Same desert, same dead air. The limestone cliffs of the Jordan Valley overlook the Salt Sea, holding hundreds of silent caves in the rock. Here, a sect of scribes would later hide their most precious texts in clay jars, desperate to preserve a record of the spiritual laws governing the land. The Dead Sea Scrolls, sealed in jars in the caves of Qumran 2,000 years ago, hold fragments of almost every book in the Old Testament. But they do not just preserve the canonical text, they preserve the terror of the men who copied it. Among the fragments pulled from Cave 4 is a document catalogued by archaeologists as 4Q Testimonia. It is a collection of ancient proof texts, a warning sheet gathered together on a single piece of leather. See the scene. A scribe sitting in the low light of a desert cave, copying out the exact words of Joshua's curse. But when he finishes the biological equation of the firstborn and the youngest, he does not stop writing. He adds a chilling, prophetic expansion. The scroll of 4Q Testimonia describes the man who will one day attempt to rebuild Jericho, not merely as a doomed father, but as an instrument of Belial, a human snare. The text warns, that this future builder will turn the reconstructed walls into a stronghold of wickedness, shedding blood like water on the breastwork of the city. Read that again. The Qumran community did not view Joshua's curse as a historical footnote or a closed chapter. They viewed the ruined foundation as an active, waiting gateway. If a man broke the seal of the accursed thing, if he paid the blood price to resurrect the walls, he would not just be building a house. He would be opening a door in the geography of Israel that God had slammed shut. We think of curses as dying out over time, fading like an echo in a canyon. The men of the desert believed time only sharpened the blade. The older the buried stones got, the more lethal the trap became. Go back to the King James text to see why they were so afraid. Look at the exact warning Joshua issues to his army in the verse just prior to the curse. Joshua 6:18 reads, "And ye in any wise keep yourselves from the accursed thing, lest ye make yourselves accursed. When ye take of the accursed thing, and make the camp of Israel a curse, and trouble it." Stop right there. Watch what the text does. Look at the final phrase, "and trouble it." The Hebrew word translated as trouble is aha. It means to bring taboo, to severely distress, to bring a supernatural ruin. It is no coincidence that the soldier who violates this exact command in the very next chapter is named Achan, the troubler. The warning is entirely geometric. To touch the cherem is to absorb the cherem. I hold the Qumran scroll as one tradition's record, a window into the ancient, haunted mindset of the scribes who lived in the shadow of that cursed ground. But their fear was not theoretical. It was deeply, physically architectural. The scroll of 4Q Testimonia echoes the exact contagion of Joshua 6:18. The scribes understood that the foundation stones of Jericho were waiting for a mind arrogant enough to look at a divine quarantine and see only a tactical opportunity. But the specific payment Joshua named, the firstborn for the foundation, the youngest for the gates, was not a random, poetic cruelty invented on the spot. The men of Qumran knew exactly what that biological equation looked like. The ancient Near East had a name for it, and the practice was already buried in the dirt under their feet, long before Israel ever crossed the Jordan River. A blood price for a building was not a new concept in the ancient world. The pagan kings of the Canaanite valleys had already perfected the dark art of binding spirits to their city walls, using a ritual that leaves its physical evidence in the archaeological record to this day. What exactly is a foundation sacrifice, and how does it explain the terrifying precision of Joshua's decree? Look down into the excavated dirt beneath the ancient Canaanite gates of Megiddo and Giza. When modern spades cut through the soil of these fortress cities, they did not just find buried masonry. Beneath the massive stone thresholds, carefully placed right under the heavy cornerstones, they found clay jars, and inside those jars were the skeletal remains of infants. Picture it. A Canaanite king stands at the edge of a new trench. He is building a fortress. He needs the walls to hold against invading armies and spiritual terrors. But he does not rely on mortar alone. He relies on blood. This is the ancient, buried reality of the foundation sacrifice. I hold this as the historical record, the brutal architecture of the world Israel was marching into. When a pagan ruler laid the first stone of a gate, a life was offered to the earth. The belief was dark, but to them it was mechanically precise. The blood of the sacrifice was meant to bind a territorial spirit to the physical architecture. The ghost of the slain became the guardian of the threshold, locked into the masonry to repel enemies. Same desert, same dark logic. Now take that archaeological terror and bring it back to the ashes of Jericho. Return to the exact phrasing of the King James Bible in Joshua 6:26. He shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn, and in his youngest son shall he set up the gates of it. Stop right there. We read that verse as a miraculous lightning strike prediction. We assume God is simply threatening to punish a future builder, but read it through the lens of the Canaanite jars. Joshua is not inventing a random punishment. He is describing an exact, existing ritual of demonic architecture. He is weaponizing the enemy's blueprint. Usually, a Canaanite king sacrificed a slave's child or a prisoner of war. The cost was paid by the vulnerable. But Joshua's curse flips the equation. By declaring the ruins of Jericho cherem the accursed thing, he guarantees that if an Israelite ever tries to resurrect this pagan stronghold, the price will not be a slave. The soil will demand the builder's own bloodline. The cost of breaking the divine quarantine is the absolute end of his own name. Watch what the text does. It does not say the sons will die of old age. It links their breath directly to the stones. The Aramaic scribes who compiled Targum Jonathan understood this terrifying synchronicity. The ancient paraphrase lingers on the dread of the builder, suggesting a chilling timeline where the construction project itself becomes an altar of consumption. As the walls rise, the sons fall. The foundation demands the firstborn. The heavy wooden gates, the final pieces of the fortress, demand the youngest. Sit with that. Joshua essentially whispered a spiritual lock into the ash. If you want this demonic architecture so badly, if you want to resurrect a Canaanite gate on ground God has permanently burned, you will have to pay the Canaanite price. And for 500 years, no man in Israel was willing to pay it. The oasis of Jericho remained a jagged, rotting wasteland. Geographically perfect, but completely quarantined by fear. The math of the blood equation was simply too high. 5 centuries of silence stretched over the ruined oasis, the heavy stones waiting in the dark for a man arrogant enough to test the boundary. But the dirt does not stay empty forever, and a shifting political wind was about to make the cursed real estate irresistible. Who was the man willing to look at the burned threshold of a dead city and decide his own family was an acceptable price for a wall? For 500 years, the merchant caravans crossing the ford of the Jordan River did something strange when they reached the most fertile ground in the territory. They drank from the ancient, rushing springs. They rested their animals in the deep shade of the date palms. But when the sun began to drop behind the limestone cliffs, they packed their tents and moved deliberately, away from the great, rotting mound of ash in the center of the oasis. Picture it. Generations of travelers, kings, and armies passing by a tactical gold mine, refusing to dig a single trench. We assume the curse of Joshua wiped Jericho off the map entirely, but the biblical text is far more precise than that. The location itself was not erased. It was occupied. But it was occupied in fear. Turn your eyes to the King James text of 2 Samuel chapter 10. It is the golden era of Israel. 5 centuries after the walls fell, King David's ambassadors have been deeply humiliated by a foreign king, their garments cut and their beards shaved off. In verse 5, David sends them a message: "Tarry at Jericho until your beards be grown, and then return." Stop right there. Read that again. David does not send his men into a fortress. He sends them to an unwalled settlement. The Book of Judges calls this exact location the city of palm trees. People lived around the edges of the quarantine. They farmed the perimeter. They drew water from the springs. But no one built a wall. No one set up a gate. Pitching a tent was survival. Laying a foundation stone was suicide. They knew the exact boundaries of the blood equation. Joshua's decree was mechanically specific. "Cursed be the man that riseth up and buildeth this city." To construct a military stronghold, to lay dressed masonry into the earth, was to cross the tripwire. For 500 years, The Israelites understood the difference between occupying the dirt and claiming the foundation. Same oasis, same fear. But 5 centuries is a long time for a loaded spring to sit in the dark. The memory of the screaming and the ash begins to fade. The kingdom of Israel fractures into 2. The northern 10 tribes establish their own throne, spiraling into a spiritual dark age. And eventually, a king named Ahab takes power in the capital city of Samaria. See the scene. 1 Kings chapter 16 describes a monarch who does more to provoke the God of Israel than all the kings who were before him. Ahab marries Jezebel of Sidon. He does not just tolerate Canaanite worship, he institutionalizes it. He builds a temple for Baal. He raises up the Asherah poles. He brings back the gods of the Canaanites. And when you bring back the gods of Canaan, you bring back the architecture of Canaan. Watch what the text does. The spiritual climate of the entire nation has shifted. The fear of Joshua's quarantine evaporates. The God who burned Jericho is now treated by the ruling class as an outdated, localized deity. And his Sherem, his divine ban, is mocked as desert superstition. The geographical reality of Jericho is sitting right on the border, a perfectly positioned oasis practically begging to be militarized. The heavy, buried stones of the Canaanite ruins are just waiting to be repurposed. The trap has been armed in the dirt for 500 years, waiting for a mind arrogant enough to test it. For 5 centuries, the soil of the city held its breath, guarding a biological equation that no king in Israel dared to trigger. But in the darkest spiritual era of the northern kingdom, a man from the town of Bethel looks at the ashes and decides the prime real estate is finally worth the sacrifice. Who was Heel the Bethelite? And what exactly happened the day he finally broke the earth and ordered his men to lower the first massive stone into the dirt? The road down from Bethel is steep, dropping 3,000 feet through the jagged limestone of the Judean wilderness before hitting the heavy heat of the Jordan Valley. A man named Hiel is making this walk. He is not carrying a sword, he is carrying building plans. Heavy stonemason tools and the royal backing of Ahab, the king of Israel. See the scene. The spiritual quarantine of the nation has been broken from the top down. Look at the exact wording of the King James text in 1 Kings 16:34. In his days did Heel the Bethelite build Jericho. Stop right there. The text does not just give us his name, it gives us his geography. And in the biblical narrative, geography is the lens of motive. Hiel is a Bethelite. Hundreds of years earlier, Bethel was the place where the patriarch Jacob dreamed of the ladder reaching into heaven. It was literally named the House of God. But by the time Hiel is born, the soil of Bethel has been thoroughly corrupted. Turn to a cross-reference. In 1 Kings 12:29, when the northern kingdom split from Judah, their first king, Jeroboam, made a calculated political move to keep his citizens from worshipping at the temple in Jerusalem. He forged 2 idols of gold, and he set the one in Bethel, and the other put he in Dan, golden calves, a pagan system of worship installed directly in Hiel's hometown, same location, completely inverted theology. Hiel is a product of this environment. He has grown up in a culture that treats the God of Israel as a localized, manageable force, sharing equal space with the Baals and the fertility gods of Canaan. To a man raised in the shadow of a golden calf, the ancient curse of Joshua does not sound like a lethal boundary. It sounds like a dusty myth, an outdated desert superstition meant to scare off the weak. And Jericho is a tactical gold mine. Sitting at the major ford of the Jordan River, controlling the lucrative trade routes flowing from the east, it is the perfect place for King Ahab to establish a fortified garrison. Hiel looks at the ashes, the untouched perimeter, the pristine springs running uselessly into the sand, and he does not see a graveyard. He sees a promotion. Picture it. The caravan arrives. The tents are pitched, but this time, they do not stay on the safe edges of the oasis. The workers walk straight into the center of the ruins. They start clearing the 500 years of overgrowth and hardened mud. They begin digging the deep, wide trenches for the new foundation stones. I hold this as the natural reality of the text, a detail not explicitly written but demanded by the geography. The local tribes must have watched in absolute terror. For centuries, the survival rule of the valley was simple. Drink the water, but do not touch the stones. Yet Hiel is breaking the earth. He is arrogant enough to look at a divine, geographical decree and assume his own ambition is stronger than a 500-year-old warning. But there is a terrifying detail in the blood equation that we often rush past. The curse Joshua spoke in the ashes did not say the builder would die. The builder is left physically untouched. The Sherem, the accursed soil, demands a different payment entirely. Look back at the wording. He shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn. Hiel does not come to the Jordan Valley alone. He brings his household. He brings his sons. And the moment his workers lower the massive cornerstone into the freshly dug dirt, the ancient, dormant trigger buried in the ashes finally snaps shut. How fast did the spiritual lock close on the eldest son of Bethel, and what does the Hebrew reveal about the exact moment he fell? The timeline of the blood equation is the most terrifying part of the curse. Look closely at the grammar of 1 Kings 16. 34 inches the King James text. In his days did Hiel the Bethelite build Jericho. He laid the foundation thereof in Abiram his firstborn, and set up the gates thereof in his youngest son Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake by Joshua, the son of Nun. Stop right there. The text names the sons. Abiram, the firstborn. Segub, the youngest. When Hiel's workers finally break through the ash and lower the first massive cornerstone into the dirt, something breaks in his household. The Hebrew text uses the phrase Abiram, which literally translates to at the cost of Abiram. It is an exchange. The text does not say Abiram fell off a scaffold. It does not say a stone crushed him. It simply says the foundation was laid in him. The ancient rabbis reading Targum Jonathan debated whether the sons died of a sudden plague, or if Hiel, driven mad by the ancient pagan ritual he was trying to emulate, actually murdered his own children and buried them under the stones. I hold that as rabbinic speculation, not the biblical text. The text does not require a human knife. It requires a divine transaction. See the scene. The massive foundation stone thuds into the dirt, and the life of the eldest son stops. This is where the psychological horror of the story deepens. Hiel has just lost his firstborn. A normal man would connect the death to the 500-year-old warning. He would look at the stone in the dirt, drop his tools, and walk away. But Hiel is from Bethel. He is operating under the dark, apostate system of King Ahab. He does not see the death as a divine judgment. He sees it as an acceptable, albeit tragic, cost of doing business. He rationalizes the curse. Perhaps Abiram was sick. Perhaps it was a coincidence. Hiel is a man so blinded by ambition and the pagan culture around him that he decides to keep building. Picture it. The walls of Jericho start to rise. The ancient masonry is resurrected. Month after month, year after year, the garrison takes shape, and the silence of the desert returns. The blood equation seems to have been satisfied. Hiel's other sons live. The work continues. But the curse Joshua spoke was not a single event. It was chronological. He shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn, and in his youngest son shall he set up the gates of it. The trap has 2 doors. Heel has paid the entrance fee, but the exit fee is still waiting for the final piece of the fortress to be installed. What happens when the walls are finally finished, and Heel's men bring the massive wooden gates to close the city once more? The heavy timber is dragged through the dust, scarred with bronze fittings and thick iron hinges. The walls of the fortress are finally finished, baking in the relentless heat of the Jordan Valley. It has taken years of grueling labor to resurrect the ancient perimeter, and now only one task remains: the hanging of the gates. Picture it. Heel stands in the courtyard, watching his men position the massive wooden doors into the stone threshold. He is older now. He has lived for years in the shadow of the foundation stone that cost him his firstborn. He convinced himself Abiram's death was a tragedy, an illness, a casualty of the harsh desert environment. He chose the theology of Bethel over the warning of Joshua, and he kept his men working. The limestone blocks went up. The watchtowers were stationed. His youngest son, Segub, grew up running through the scaffolding of a cursed city, completely unaware that his life was mathematically tied to its completion. But the dirt of Jericho does not forget a blood equation. Turn to the second half of the King James text in 1 Kings 16:34. The chronicle of Heel's ambition ends with brutal, mechanical precision, and set up the gates thereof in his youngest son Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake by Joshua the son of Nun. Stop right there. Look at the specific architectural action. Set up the gates. The Hebrew root word here is yatsav. It means to station, to stand upright, to firmly establish a boundary. In the ancient world, a city was not a city until the gates were hung. The walls could be 80 feet high, but without the gates, the perimeter was void. The gates were the seat of authority, the place of judgment, the final seal of security. Heel thinks he is establishing security. He thinks he is locking the desert out. Watch what the text does. It reveals the ultimate reversal. Heel is not building a defense mechanism. He has spent years and unimaginable wealth meticulously constructing an altar that is actively consuming his own bloodline. When the men heave the ropes, pulling the massive timber upright, the heavy hinges slot into the stonework. The seal is closed. And in that exact moment, the final biological trigger snaps. The Hebrew text repeats the preposition of exchange, be Segub. At the cost of Segub, the youngest son dies. See the scene. The gates swing shut. The dust settles over the threshold. And a second grave has to be dug in the shadow of the new wall. I hold this as the absolute, terrifying climax of the biological timeline Joshua spoke into the ashes. It was never a random punishment. It was a precise, inescapable contract. The foundation required the beginning of Heel's strength. The gates required the end of it. The Sherem, the divine ban, extracted the full Canaanite price from an Israelite father, who thought the God of his ancestors was simply a myth he could outbuild. Same word, same weight, 500 years of silence, broken by the sound of a closing door and the end of a man's lineage. Joshua's prophecy was not hovering in the clouds. It was waiting in the heavy, buried stones of the earth, perfectly preserved until a man from Bethel forced it to wake up. Heel successfully rebuilt the fortress, but the cost stripped him of his future. The city is standing, the gates are locked, and the sons are dead. But when you step back and look at the fully rebuilt walls of Jericho through the lens of this 500-year-old mystery, the architecture takes on a chilling new shape. What exactly is this fortress now? And how does the desert force us to look at the ruins of our own disobedience? Go back now to the gray, shifting ash where this film began. Joshua standing at the edge of the ruin, the final wooden beams of the Canaanite fortress burning down to nothing. The hyper-specific, chronological blood equation spoken directly into the dirt. You have read that scene 100 times, assuming it was simply a burst of military anger, a momentary curse from a victorious general. But tonight, you have a name for the dark architecture buried beneath the soil. You have the ancient terror of the cherem, the lethal contagion of the divine quarantine, and the terrifying, mechanical exactness of the Canaanite foundation's sacrifice. Jericho was never just an empty pile of rocks. It was a loaded spring. Look at the fully rebuilt city in the days of King Ahab. Heel the Bethelite walks through his new courtyard, a man who believed the apostate theology of his era could override the absolute geography of the past. He looks at the high walls and thinks he has built a military stronghold. He thinks he has conquered the oasis. But watch what the text does. Heel did not defeat the curse. He perfectly fulfilled it. He paid the exact biological price Joshua demanded in the ashes 500 years earlier. The foundation stone consumed his firstborn, Abiram. The heavy wooden gates consumed his youngest, Segub. The scribes at Qumran warned of a man who would turn the rebuilt city into a snare of blood. The Aramaic Targums knew the threshold would demand a life. Hiel simply proved them right. The stones did not yield to his ambition. They simply extracted their required payment and left him to live in the silence. This is one reading, not the final word. I offer it as the ancient understanding of the men who lived in the shadow of that valley, men who knew the cost of breaking a divine seal. But the physical reality of the biblical text is undeniable. The city of palm trees was resurrected, but it was resurrected as an open grave. Same oasis, same dead air. Hiel built a monument, but not to his own power. Every time a merchant caravan passed through those new gates, every time an Israelite soldier stood on the limestone watchtower, they were not looking at a triumph of Northern Kingdom engineering. They were looking at a massive, geographic altar. The walls of Jericho stood as a permanent, physical reminder that the word spoken by Joshua does not sleep, does not age, and does not negotiate. But a piece of the mystery remains. Why did the soil finally accept the blood? Once the sons were taken, the city was allowed to stand. The quarantine was lifted. Generations later, prophets would walk its streets. Elijah and Elisha would even visit a school of the prophets built firmly within its borders. How a cursed foundation is ultimately cleansed by time and consequence, and why God allowed holy men to dwell where a curse once ruled, is a tension the desert is still holding. We read the canonical text to find the history, but the history is waiting in the dirt. If you made it to the end of this ancient geography, comment the word "watched" below. Subscribe to the channel, because we are pulling the original context out of the dust every single week. And send this to one person who loves the deep history of the Old Testament, but has never heard the true architectural cost of Jericho's walls. The stones remember what we try to forget.